Hey, it's Chris. Veiled Fate is back, but we're doing it this time as a two-player version in Scales of Fate from IV Studios. We've got a board, we've got lots of pieces, looks similar, plays a little bit different, with obviously some overlap. Everything you need to know to help you figure out, as well as a little bit of my opinion, as always interjected. Let's go. So Scales of Fate, right? Scales of Fate takes the Veiled Fate situation where you are manipulating your 9 different colors of characters on the board state in order to win the game. Hidden deduction, spatial manipulation, and a little bit of take that. That's what this game is really bringing. And you can see on the board here, I've got most of the pieces illustrated. I've got the action spaces off to the side over here that we can throw on, but everything fits in this board. The basic concept is the same as Veiled Fate. You want your markers around the outside higher, asterisks, better, because victory points are the name of the game. And you're going to be trying to score through a couple different ways. Phrasing, Archer. But what you're scoring in this case is a little bit different than in Veiled Fate. One of the ways you're going to be scoring is by guessing who your opponent is. So very similar to Veiled Fate of trying to deduce who is and who the other person isn't. And at the beginning of the game, you will have a deck of cards here with all of those 9 characters that I mentioned, and you will draw 2 of them secretly and mark them on your sheet. Your opponent will do the same. And there are going to be 2 decks for this, so you each can potentially even have the exact same colors. So what you have to do over 3 rounds is manipulate yours positively, as well as deduce based on the deduction that is provided on a round-by-round basis to figure out who the other person is, because at the end of the game, you gain points if you guess both correctly. You lose points if you don't guess either correctly, and if you only get 1 right, well, you just get 0. So it doesn't really affect you that way. The other way that you're scoring the vast majority of your points here is those markers around the outside, and you can see that there are numbers around the edge of the board. And here's the biggest high risk, high reward, I like it, I don't like it element of things in the scoring aspect, right? You take your 2, and you take the difference between your 2. Okay, sounds pretty straightforward. Okay, Chris, well, that goes back to the beginning with the little asterisks I said, right? You want maybe 1 to be high up at the 14 and 1 to be down at the 0. Okay, fantastic. But the other thing that you can do, the little twist on that, is that if both of yours are on the same spot, you just get whatever value that is. So can I just get them both high? It's going to be maybe a lot easier than getting them both, separated out high and low. Oh, okay. But if you're very focused on your own, as with Veiled Fate, then the other person, if they're paying attention halfway whatsoever, is going to know exactly what you're trying to do, and they're going to get in your way. They're going to take that and they're going to stop you, and they're going to, basically knock you off the board, both literally and figuratively in that way. Now, it's got a few elements that are similar, right? We've got age 1 cards, we've got age 2 cards, and age 3 cards. And these cards are how you set up the game at the beginning of every round. And they basically just tell you there's one of these special little red tokens that you're going to flip over after it's laid down. And these have the symbols, if you're familiar with Veiled Fate, of both the sickle and the omega. And the omega meaning you are gaining that many points, the sickle meaning you are losing that many points. And there's one of these red ones per round. They are also equally divided between the white and the green, which we'll talk about what that means in a second. And then the rest of the spots, the rest of the 8 spots, because 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 3 times 3 is 9, are filled by these golden ones, which again are very similar, but it's not high risk and high reward as the other ones, but the same green and white configurations that you're going to be manipulating. And then you see that it tells you where on this grid that you're going to be placing the red one. It tells you the deduction rule that we'll talk about in a second. And then it tells you the abyss rule as well as where the action spaces are, because these action tokens that I mentioned right here, these are the main crux of the game, because what you're going to be doing on a turn-by-turn basis is manipulating the workers, the colors, the people, the gods, whatever they are, onto one of these and then taking said action that they represent. As either, well, taking that action, and then the other alternative thing that you can do is place one of your tokens that has already been acquired from maybe said action spots in the first place in order to manipulate the board and score potentially, right? And so these score in different ways, which I'll show you in a second. And then you do this over 3 rounds. Now the last part, because Failed Fate had an abyss, this has an abyss too. And I mentioned at the bottom of this card, you can see that it tells you exactly the abyss. If things are to the left, the marker, then you lose 2 for whoever's who is in the abyss. Or if it's to the right, anyone in the abyss is going to gain 1, because you're going to be booting these characters off potentially of these action spaces, because as on notice on the card, there are only 5 action spaces going back and forth. And so until all of those action spaces are filled and there's no more of these guys to play, you go. And so then, and only then, do you figure out where things are at the end of the round. Now, the deduction portion of things comes in at the end of the round. At the top of these cards, there's some text that says, okay, this is what you have to basically guess who, if you will. And this is the condition you have to be truthful about in that sense. Demis out of play, meaning they are not on the board. So if you have any that are not on the board, then you have to say yes to that. And so then your opponent is going to look at which ones are on the board and which ones that are off the board. They're going to grab their handy dandy little sheet here of scratching and scritching and mark those accordingly to help deduce. And each round has a slight difference of that. Each age has a slight difference of that. Demis on God tokens. Okay, demis at the 4 and 6 victory point renowns. Demis at the 8 and 10 point renowns. So those are all sort of the ways in which you're going to be trying to deduce. Now with this card in play, Camera Magic, now you can see what I've got going on here with all of the other Sickles and Omegas set up. And this is where the action spots, as well as these little guys along the right side, come into play. Because if you move any one of these, again, on your turn, onto one of these spots, you take the various action like I mentioned. This moves the Abyss token. This sends someone off of the board. And this is the tricky part, is because there's also the God actions, which are 1 time per game, which you can also utilize. But if you do, then you're going to lose a victory point later on at the end of the game. And you do that by representing by flipping it over. And this allows you, to smite them, put them in the abyss. That allows you to switch places with them. And this allows you to steal from your opponent. One of the little worker guys right here. This is also where the main crux of the actual gameplay is going. Because if you lay on one of these green, white, or red spots, you gather one of these. And these are also what you can play on your turn, because you're going to be playing these potentially anywhere that they fit, anywhere that you want, anywhere that you can kind of slide them, because they all score similarly, but differently. The white, well, anything in that row gets scored, that's white, if you have a person on a spot touching it. Or, similarly, green in the green side of things. Now, red does something different. Red only scores the one that you are next to. So if anyone's touching that one, then they only score that one. So you can see that things are going to get crowded quickly. Things are going to move quickly. This is not a long game whatsoever, but the strategy based on the positioning from the age card is going to determine the game setup that you're going to be dealing with. Now in ages 2 and 3, the red spot will rotate, and so it won't always be down here. So there will be some variation, but this is the general board state that you're going to be dealing with and mitigating and strategizing as you go along. That is the game in a nutshell. And you're going to start to slowly see these guys separate. You're going to score them round by round basis. And you're going to be slowly deducing, like I said, on your sheet in order to figure out who your opponent is at the end. Strategy-wise, it's clever. It's got those significant elements of where do I position when, how do I position them in the action spots that I want to, while still then getting the workers that are going to trigger based off of that, because how can I also hide which ones I want to do what? And honestly, there's not a lot of hiding. It's really there for the pickings in terms of figuring this out. And so therein lies the dilemma. Do you just pull off any pretense with this game and say, screw it, I'm going to go for what I want to go and have that happen? Or do you really try and play the long game and hope that your opponent doesn't? And for me personally right now, I'm struggling with this. I really don't know how I feel when it comes to this game. I see the strategy. I see the gameplay. There is just a slight disconnect that I'm having because I feel like at times playing it, I just want to do more. I want to manipulate more. The limited number of action spaces, considerably less than the actual number of characters, colors, if you will, is something I am still trying to wrap my mind around and figure out how I like in that way. And maybe because we are not great deceivers, my wife and I, of each other in this manner, it became a little bit more obvious of who was who. And so then it became who can find those spots and manipulate and place your servants down in the right areas to fully utilize and maximize them. I really like the main board interactions setup, the servants, the action spaces in between, and even potentially getting multiple bonuses going on at once. The Abyss is nice. The Abyss changing back and forth of what it may be, similar to the base game, is reminiscent of Veiled Fate. But I don't like it as much because I don't think it's as overarchingly meaningful because I can't get as many people down there as I may like. I can't get as many people on the board as I may like. I can't use these cool god powers as much as I may like because it's not just available ad nauseum. And yeah, I like the fact that if you go for something slightly more powerful, adaptable, and an extra action on a round, you're going to pay the price at the end of the game. With great power, right? Great penalty. Is that the phrasing? Okay, anyway. But at the same time, I just want more out of it. The most intriguing is, sometimes in these games with the objectives that you are given in terms of figuring out the opponents, they just don't happen whatsoever. And you're not really that penalized in terms of endgame scoring. I think it's 3 points if you get them both. It's -1 if you don't get either. It's not much, and I know, but it sort of is a disconnect for me. If you're going to incorporate the, clue whodunit sort of situation, I would like to see that as more of a main mechanism for me personally. Make that heavier in the scoring. Make that much more important. But again, that sort of makes it difficult because, like I mentioned with some of these ages, right? 8 and 10 Renown. If there's just nobody on 8 and 10 Renown, if both of you are playing smart and avoiding those, not to give your opponent any clue, you could also both end up screwed at the end of the game. And I don't know about you, but I, as a gamer, don't mind negative scores. But I know a lot of people get pissed off with low scores or negative scores in games. But I think, I would like more of a penalty, more of a reward, something else deductive in that way to add to that mechanism as a whole, because I don't feel that shining through as strongly as this being more of an abstract with thematic incorporation similar to Mythic Mischief in that way otherwise. And again, that's not a bad comparison, right? Like, Mythic Mischief is my favorite IB Studios game. It's an abstract with a theme. This is very similar. But again, I just wish for a little bit more. I wish I could have these extra spots out there, or there were more than one or two other types of the black to have more interaction and more manipulation. This is one of those games where sometimes you do want to screw yourself. And how comfortable are you doing that? Like I said, you want high and a low? Okay, great. You send yourself to the Abyss, you make the Abyss marker that way, you manipulate the workers to move yourself down in that color. And it's always a little bit counterintuitive if you're like me, because never in many other games are you trying to actually get a low score, right? It is in the Veiled Fate universe. It has the themes and the inklings, the tendrils of Veiled Fate within it. I guess what I'm saying out of both sides of my mouth is it feels like it's in the middle. I feel like I would like more embracing of that, more weight of that mechanic taking a hold as the driving factor. And sort of it's straddling the fence for me and getting a little bit on this side and a little bit on this side. And it makes me go, I see what it's doing what it's doing well, but I just don't know how I feel about it. Let's take a step back and let's say, okay, Chris, if you're conflicted, where does this fall? Because in all of my other IB Studios games, videos, I've said, updated my rankings and where they fall after playing them. And so that's why I said earlier, Mythic Mischief is my favorite game by far and away. So when I compare it to that, that's not a bad thing, like I mentioned. Veiled Fate, though, especially with the expansions, is still number 2. Head and Shoulders, right? Head and Shoulders, those two above all of the other Ivy Studios games. Tend is a tricky one comparatively because it's not like the others. Fractured Sky does the bluffing aspects of things as well. And so those ones are kind of falling in the next tier. And I guess I'd make the argument, as someone who plays a lot of two-player games, this is my type of game in general. But it falls somewhere between those two tiers for me, and I just can't figure out if a dozen more plays is going to notch it up to the upper tier, or if a dozen more plays is going to make me more frustrated by some of these issues and put it down further. That's tricky for me because I don't like coming out and saying, well, I'm just not sure how I feel about this game, right? Like, I want to love this because I also love the dueling games. As much as I snark on the trend of the dueling games iterations that is 2025, they are a great type of game. I love Splendor Duel. I love Seven Wonders Duel. I love Azul Duel. Everduel Duel is awesome. Res Arcana is not. King of Tokyo is not as much. There's an upcoming Flamecraft one that looks awesome. And then we have Scales of Fate here. And the trick with these duel games, you know, comparatively to the ones that are doing it well and the ones compared to their base games in that way, is that they give you that spin that is close and reminiscent and similar, but they make it easily stand out differently than its predecessor or namesake in that way. And from that aspect alone, yes, this does that. At the same time, I feel like it almost would have been more to my liking if it had been a little bit further away, because I almost feel like it's a little bit of a roll and write situation when you see the roll and writes that are based off of games as well, that try to fit the base game mechanisms into a new format. And I just don't know in this way if this is square peg round hole, or again, sort of like a mind bug situation for me, where the more I played it, the more I grew to appreciate it, because like I said, this is my type of game and I can see that happening. So enough blathering. Brief recap of pros, cons, and final thoughts. Pros: I like the dynamic setup. I like the strategy and the abstract feel. I like the action spots. And I do like the strategic manipulation of putting these servants in the rows and columns. But again, I think that the strategy of putting them out there to activate would be a lot more deductive if you could have, you know, characters on almost every single space there, and then adding that element of, did he activate it for the blue, as opposed to, you know, activating it here when it becomes a little bit clearer in that sense. The strategy that I really like, the tension that I really like, the tension that does this really well, though at the same time with all of my concerns one way or the other, is that the maneuvering of the actual ones of your gods, either trying to get them exactly the same and the fine paper thin line that is, or get them as far apart, makes it a little tricky. And one definitely spoils things a little bit more if you're really trying to get one up and one down, right? Repeatedly doing that. But if you're trying to keep them close together, it's high risk, high reward. And that is probably the best part of this game, tension-wise, dynamic-wise, and thought-provoking wise, that does make it a really, really good mechanism as a whole. Cons: some of the conditions to help you deduce, you're going to have that element be a little more lacking potentially in some of the games, especially if you're more cognizant of it and you try and keep your people out and the other person does as well. Con also, I don't think as a, you know, a deduction-esque game in the line of Veiled Fate, where again, like I said, that is one of the main mechanisms, that is given enough emphasis for me personally to make it feel like it is as ingrained as I would like it. Like, high risk, high reward. Make it meaningful in that way. Also, god powers are cool. Wish I got to use them more. More action spots. Wish there were more. Abyss. Again, Abyss is good, but the utilization of it is not as much as I would like. So that's where my pros and cons are. So final thoughts. Again, like, I'm kind of a mixed bag on this one. You know, I think another half dozen plays are going to help me sort that out. But like I said, are you looking for a two-player dueling game? Are you looking for a little bit of secret information? If you are, it has it. but it sort of reminds me a little bit in the way of Beast, where Beast was marked as this hidden movement game. It's really not a hidden movement game. It's an asymmetric dynamic power struggle between a one versus all, where hidden movement is part of it, but not the main incorporation. And so if you go in thinking that's going to be the main thing, you're going to be disappointed. If you go in knowing it's not, okay, expectation's different. And so that's what I'd say with this. If you're really looking for more of a deductive two-person thing, this isn't going to be your vibe. But if you want some of that dynamic tension of placement on the board to mitigate, to alleviate, and to, well, just outthink and outsmart your opponent with a little bit of placement variability and a little bit of that deduction as well, it's going to be a better fit for you. It's more about you knowing what your expectations and desires are out of this game, because this game is what it is, right? It's not going to be any different, and that's okay. But that's the main thing. Do not go into this thinking it's going to be one thing and have it be another. It is still a good game, despite all of my thoughts and my criticisms, right? And I want to be very clear about that. But for me personally right now, my own personal taste, I have it a notch lower. There you go. Thank you for watching. Stay classy. Thank you for Ivy Studios for sending me the prototype to talk to you about. Peace out. Have a great freaking fantastic day.